countries that are now leading the way are Iran, and we'll talk about probably proliferation concerns later on. But Iran has a very thriving and very solid civilian nuclear power program with this 40 megawatts heavy water reactor. But he also has enrichment capabilities, a research facility, uranium mining. So it's a very complex, full-scale cycle. The United Arab Emirates has introduced a nuclear power plant, and he has been the very first Gulf country doing so. He has operated the Baraka reactor, and the UAE certainly has the record of showing how a nuclear power plant can be built on time and on budget, therefore prompting more other countries, follow suit with their investments. And of course, then there is Turkey, as you mentioned, Elisa, which is going to be the third country that will introduce nuclear power in the region, and quite frankly, also bringing nuclear technology in the Mediterranean. But then I think there are other countries that are really making important strides. I mean, we have to remember, for example, Egypt that has just, for example, completed, the first phase of its Daba nuclear power program. And just yesterday, Rosatom actually received a new licensing permit for the second phase of the construction. You also have some other developments that are quite important. For example, Saudi Arabia, in February, DG Grossi, the International Atomic Energy Agency Director General, went to Saudi and very explicitly said that the IAEA now has a thriving technical cooperation for the development of a Saudi nuclear program. And you have very, very recently Morocco signing an agreement with Russia for a potential exploration of nuclear technology, and that Jordan now considering, for example, embracing small nuclear reactors.
So there is a perception that nuclear energy may be one step down the road towards nuclear weapons, but there are lots of things that we can do to try to stop that pathway, and explicit non-proliferation commitments, as well as cooperation with international institutions, can really help that.
And the growing price of oil, as you know, on the global market has been put on further strain on Pakistan's economy, making it more open to outside influences. And Pakistan's issues have gotten worse, like similar to other countries in the region, through this protracted conflict now between Russia and Ukraine, and the continuous, sanctions against Iran. Currently, Pakistan has 6 operational reactors. One is planned, and about 7% of Pakistan's electricity comes from nuclear power. When we look at China, there are 42 planned reactors, 22 under construction, and 54 operational reactors. And China is perhaps the biggest in the market, making rapid progress with construction of new nuclear power reactors. With respect to India, there are 8 reactors under construction, 12 are planned, and 22 are operational. Pakistan has 6 operational reactors and 1 planned. So in the light of, Pakistan-Turkish strategic relations, which are defense-oriented in nature, there has been a lot of, disinformation going on and making rounds whenever there is a defense delegation that goes for military-to-military ties. And much of this disinformation in the media comes from India. You can just check up the sources. And there is always an insinuation that Pakistan must be providing nuclear technology or nuclear blueprint to Turkey. When, on the surface of it, there is no such talks that are being held between the two countries. But it is not to say, as an academic, I'd like to speculate that given Pakistan's experience in running nuclear reactors with a great nuclear safety record, Pakistan should, in all sense and purposes, offer help to countries like Turkey that want to embark on this. But for now, no bilateral conversation in this realm is happening.
In Turkey, we find that 47% of the public think the country should cancel construction of its nuclear power plants. Now, that's a minority of the public, but it is still a substantial number of individuals. And many of these individuals may be concerned because of the strong perceived ties between nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. As Rabia mentioned, there's lots of information and concerns about these issues, and repeated studies have shown that people make the association between nuclear power and nuclear weapons, even though there's quite a long chain of developments that has to happen from one to the other. So some of this may be a question of wondering about what comes next, especially in light of other developments in the nuclear field in the region. Nuclear power plants have key benefits, especially in terms of energy security. That's especially relevant, as the others on the panel have mentioned, as the price of oil increases. And they're important as the world learns to adapt to the pressures of climate change.
In my conversations, especially with some of the Arab countries, they really ask me often to say, please, when you talk about the nuclear energy program in the Middle East, clarify that, yes, there could be a connection between proliferation pursuit and nuclear energy, but many of these countries have no intention to. And I think we have to recognize that it is an inalienable right of countries, provided they are in compliance with the NPT, to pursue nuclear energy. So I think it's really important that when we talk about the narrative of these countries, and I agree completely with Rabia, that we are also treating these countries as responsible stakeholders, right? So having said that, there are, in my view, a convergence of factors that do concern me personally. And I see this in particularly in most recent developments. And I talk in particular about these triangulations among Iran, Saudi, and Israel that to me might prove to be quite dangerous for the region beyond actually nuclear proliferation. Now, let me mention a couple of factors that I have noticed in my interaction with the region. I was also in Doha very recently for another weapons of mass destruction free zone discussion. So the very first element that I think we need to notice is that there has been a very clear shift, at least in the last 10 years, a power shift in the region from the more traditional Arab leaders, Egypt, for example, Syria, now completely destroyed by the civil war, Iraq, into the Gulf countries. And this is something that in Harvard we call the Gulf momentum. So if you look at the GDP of these countries, if you look at the economic power, the capabilities that these countries have, this means these countries will be able to scale up their nuclear capabilities, nuclear technology much faster than what we have ever seen in the region or elsewhere in the world. And that makes it a concern, because we could imagine a Saudi program going very fast into developing and acquiring, sensitive capabilities. When I was in the region very recently, one of the main concerns is obviously that the introduction of nuclear power plants in the region makes them a very clear target for potential, hybrid or asymmetric warfare. So in all this, we have to read the introduction of nuclear technology in a region that is destabilizing in terms of power shifts, in terms of global influence. Now, I think something can be done. And again, I go back to countries like Turkey, for example, in countries like, in the Gulf, they could provide the regional leadership that I'm not seeing. This attempt, for example, to revitalize the weapons of mass destruction free zone, despite the rhetoric and the difficulty of reaching that goal, is a very important political process, because it brings countries to the table, it allows them to vent and share their concerns and build some kind of trust. So more of these processes are necessary. I think Turkey needs to be in the game, quite frankly. I think Israel needs to be in the game. And right now, the concerns that some of the countries face really need to be tackled on the collective level. So I think might have all this influence, all these factors will have an influence on Turkey's security calculations, no doubt about it, but it will also have serious implications for the great powers relations within the region.
We asked the public in multiple different ways whether or not they would be willing to support nuclear proliferation if Turkey did decide to go down that route. And between 59% and 73% of the Turkish public answered that they think the country should build nuclear weapons. These numbers are high. They're comparable to what we're seeing in South Korea, where there's been robust discussion for a number of years about the potential of building nuclear weapons or securing forward deployed tactical nuclear weapons from the United States. And Turkey, of course, already has weapons from NATO deployed on their soil, as well as a strong relationship with the NATO alliance. So these numbers should be concerning to us. Why is it the case that individuals in Turkey are so willing at this moment in time to build these very expensive, very destructive weapons? Turkey is situated in a dangerous geopolitical position. It has rivalries within its region. It's also part of the NATO alliance, where we're seeing a resurgence of Russian aggression. And while Turkey has strong relations with Russia, at some moments in time, there are also tensions there. Turkey also has to worry about what will happen as the US continues to act both in this region and elsewhere in the world. And so there are real security concerns that Turkey may be facing, and this could be contributing to this high level of desire for building nuclear weapons. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Turkey's perceptions of other countries and how that might affect these numbers. So one thing we can show in the data that we've collected by looking at Turkish public opinion is that if Greece, for example, signed the additional protocol, support for proliferation in Turkey would decline by 12 percentage points. Now, that's a simple policy that would have a very substantial effect on public opinion. And it does suggest that Turkey is concerned about its neighbors and about its situation within its own region. There's perhaps a perception that proliferation is around the corner, and Turkey may need to be prepared for that. Another area where we see some concern is about whether or not the US is able to act with sufficient restraint. When individuals in Turkey think that the United States is very willing to use nuclear weapons in the NATO context, that increases support for proliferation by about 9 or 10 percentage points. So US behavior in the Mediterranean and Europe, even when that behavior is demonstrating support for American allies and showing American willingness to use nuclear weapons, that is backfiring, and we are seeing support for independence from the US and for greater military capabilities in Turkey as a result. Now, another thing we look at in this survey is to more broadly think about Turkish perceptions of their relationship with the United States. And we find that increased US support for NATO, whether that support goes to Greece or it goes to countries with which Turkey is much more familiar and friendly, like, for example, Hungary, that support can raise concerns about Turkey's own relationship with the US. There's a sense that Turkey is competing with its neighbors to manage the direction of this alliance. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that the US doesn't have any options for shoring up its relationship with Turkey. We do see that when the US supports allies that are far away, where Turkey doesn't have to worry about what happens if a conflict breaks out, it doesn't have to worry about being dragged into those conflicts, like when the US supports Japan or even Taiwan. Then we do see public opinion turn towards the US, and the US is then viewed as more favorable, as a more reliable ally. So the US can communicate to its allies that it's reliable, but this work also tells us the US needs to be able to show that it can restrain its behavior, that nuclear weapons or the use of nuclear weapons is not the main solution to most international security problems. And there are ways to use safeguards and ensure communication to make sure that a world in which nuclear weapons is used is as remote of a possibility as possible.
So nuclear South Asia is already very fragile, and the situation is quite precarious as it is between India and Pakistan. The competition for new arms and nuclear modernization in the region, is attributed to the strategic change. So whenever Pakistan wants to talk to India about the nuclear situation and restraining each other's nuclear postures, India brings in China factor. And when you look at China is on a modernization spree, and looks at the US factor to be considered for its nuclear modernization. So Pakistan, I say, is at the tail end of the strategic chain. At the beginning of it is US, which influences China's decision making. China's nuclear modernization influences India's decision making and nuclear posturing, and that in turn obviously has an effect on Pakistan. So Pakistan being at tail end doesn't really have much of the momentum to give to strategic change, but absorbs all the shocks that come from top to bottom. With respect to the rivalry, so the latest crisis was obviously happened in Pulwama Balakot crisis in 2019. And, the thing is that whether both countries have learned the same lessons or not, The situation in Pulwama Balakot was pretty serious. We almost reached to the second round of escalation, but then, crisis termination, and I've written about it, rested squarely with Pakistan as to how it reciprocated and the proportionality of its response and the release of the Indian pilot, all of that, and the decision making that was done during crisis by the leadership of that time. I think all of that contributed to not taking the crisis to the second level of escalation. But that cannot be true for a future crisis to come. So what lessons both India and Pakistan draw is incredibly important. For a country like Turkey, President Erdogan in UNGA speeches have been making a special mention of Kashmir. He has, raised this issue with both India and Pakistan, saying that, you should resort to UNSC resolutions and find a solution for this Kashmir conflict. But to be really honest, while Pakistan has approached and has been approached by various countries and has always welcomed the third party mediation in the Kashmir crisis, it has been India's principal stance that it is a bilateral issue and they just lock out every other third party to negotiate. So while Turkey is doing a great balancing act between Russia and Ukraine and is managing its alliances, I really doubt that it has a very strong role to play between the India-Pakistan crisis. So what Pakistan is grateful for is President Erdogan making the statement and raising the issue and keeping the issue alive and pushing both countries to seek resolutions. The strategic stability in the region is very, very fragile because there are still pockets where crisis can erupt, and any crisis has the potential of leading to war, which can be raised to the nuclear threat levels. So that's how I see the situation.
What happens in the case of a nuclear accident, which is a transnational, event in and of itself. But let me also mention that I think there are other things that we need to do, and we need to do seriously. I wrote very recently about a new generation of negative security assurances. For me, there is no longer the case. We cannot continue with this platitude of promises and vague statements that we make to non-nuclear weapon states, that we will not attack them. That this is no longer, viable. What Ukraine war has shown, in my view, is not necessarily that we don't know how to do nuclear deterrence, is that we don't know how to protect non-nuclear weapon states from nuclear blackmailing and nuclear coercion. And so in that case, what is the collective defense mechanism that we can apply? Let me also mention that, a case I've looked at now recently is the fact that Ukraine never actually called for Article 51, Chapter 7 of the UN. And when I asked some of my Ukrainian colleagues why wasn't the case, right? The Ukrainians told me, because even if we had invoked him, nobody would have come. So what does it tell you about the collective defense system? So it is in the interest of the nuclear weapon states to really give guarantees to non-nuclear weapon states that nuclear weapons is not the way to go. Otherwise, we'll end up in a situation with plenty of nuclear latency crises and really big instability around the world. Let me just finish by saying, I have looked and tracked some of the institutional discussions that are happening in the region. I find it really interesting that there are a lot of informal dialogues going on. There is a Saudi-Iran dialogue taking place in Jordan. There is a Baghdad dialogue over the Yemen war. These are, in my view, really important and encouraging platforms. These are dialogues. They're not treaties. They're not agreements. But if we are able in a way to create a front-end nuclear dialogue in the region, not when nuclear latency has already occurred, but when actually you have just the emerging of these nuclear energy programs, there is a lot of space for negotiations of standards and principles that can really bring some predictability to the region and to the world. And I think in that sense, the region could lead towards a front-end nuclear energy dialogue, which might resemble a little bit the format of the Euratom system in the European Union. So there are models that the region can use. It can really also help boost, quite frankly, the nuclear non-proliferation regime.
After the Indo-US nuclear deal, and also the increasing strategic alliance between the United States and India, Pakistan has raised this concern that giving India NSG membership while you keep Pakistan out of it, is not going to help. And I believe that if the world is really worried about Pakistan's proliferation credentials, then it should let Pakistan into NSG, because that is going to have some serious non-proliferation conditions attached to Pakistan's entry, right? And, you know, all those concerns should be addressed once Pakistan gets that membership. In that respect, Pakistan's two allies, China and Turkey, in the NSG have really been supportive of Pakistan's cause, but on two different angles, which is really fascinating, because China, on the one hand, you know, has been blocking India's entry into NSG by saying that there should be a criteria-based entry into NSG. So develop that one criteria, and then, you know, judge both India and Pakistan on it and let them enter the NSG. So you should not admit India. You know, if India meets that criteria, then judge Pakistan on that criteria as well. Whereas Turkey, which I was pleasantly surprised, has been supporting Pakistan's non-proliferation credentials, and has been saying that, you know, Pakistan and India should be given simultaneous entry into NSG, and does not talk about a criteria-based membership, and actually makes the case for Pakistan that NSG, given Pakistan's extensive, you know, contribution and experience in the area of you know, nuclear safety and operating nuclear reactors for so long, Pakistan's membership in the NSG will actually contribute to global non-proliferation objectives. And Pakistan is obviously, as a state, really grateful to both China and Turkey for, you know, supporting its entrance into NSG if that ever happens. So you know, so overall, I believe that, you know, if non-proliferation is truly your objective, the world's objective, then I think both India and Pakistan should be given simultaneous entry into NSG, and not one just because, you know, the leadership of NSG has a strategic alliance with one country and wants to prop it up and give it favors. So that will be discriminatory. So that's how I look at both Turkish and Chinese support for Pakistan's NSG membership.
I would say the key components are to work on ways to protect states from nuclear blackmail, from these emerging ways in which nuclear weapons are still being used to shape global politics, and that the answer to that can no longer really be our traditional interpretation of nuclear deterrence. It's now a question of finding conventional solutions to nuclear problems, of strengthening alliances in many different ways, and of taking things like security assurances and making sure that they incorporate consultations, that they involve multiple stakeholders, that they create crisis negotiation mechanisms, and are adaptive to the threats that we really see today. Dampening Turkey's desire or need for nuclear weapons, I think, also means continuing some of the more traditional non-proliferation policies, making it clear that states that do seek nuclear weapons will face consequences for doing so, strengthening the ability to use sanctions to try to resolve these threats should they happen. But at the same time, we need to recognize that, as I've said before, nuclear weapons are separate from nuclear energy, and Turkey very much has a strong rationale to achieve energy security, to deal with the pressing threats related to climate change. And nuclear power is a way to do that. Whatever cooperation can be mustered to make sure that these power plants can be developed safely and securely, that the domestic infrastructure to maintain them can be developed in accordance with recommendations of the IAEA and the international community, I think that's the best path forward.
I have two concerns about this. The very first one is that it's very important that non-nuclear weapon states understand what TPNW or other forms like the weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East are supposed to do, and what they are not going to be able to do. Like, there is a lot of frustration in the Middle East and in the Gulf about WMD free zone, But the problem is the expectations that these countries pose on these treaties. The weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East will not be able to disarm Israel. The TPNW is not going to be able to disarm nuclear weapon states. You can't disarm something you don't have. So you need to be clear about why you accede to these treaties and why you are doing it. And I think it's perfectly legitimate for non-nuclear weapon states to commit to each other, to establish a trust relation among each other in saying we will never pursue nuclear weapons. But it's very important that we understand what these treaties are supposed to do. And the frustration around the weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East, in my view, has resulted from wrong narrative. This has never been a disarmament treaty for Israel. This has been a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the region for countries that want to accede and don't have nuclear weapons. So my concern about introducing all these institutions and these regimes is that it creates a sense of expectations that are then constantly frustrated. And that, in my view, increases the grievances. So the way to go, in my view, is not so much about, exactly like Rabia said, to create communities among countries that are already committing to nuclear non-proliferation, to nuclear disarmament, but is creating new avenues for nuclear weapon states, non-nuclear weapon states, to exchange views, to build trust, and to move along together. The TPNW doesn't do this. And to me, that creates, again, a discrepancy that then needs to be repaired in some ways.
I believe that the nuclear security summits had given a great platform for countries to exchange best practices, and that doesn't require to be a part of NPT or NSG or any other forum. So I've written this elsewhere as well, that probably Pakistan, India, China, they can come together and have a trilateral nuclear security summit where they exchange best practices. And that goes for Turkey too. As Turkey enters into, and has its nuclear reactor operational by next year, I think nothing stops Pakistan and Turkey to exchange best practices. And, Pakistan has a nuclear center of excellence, which is endorsed by IAEA for such purposes. And I would believe that Pakistan should open it up to Turkish, officials from the nuclear energy sector and scientists, and bring them over and train them and talk to them about the best practices that have given Pakistan this stellar record in the nuclear energy domain over a period of years. So that is one thing that Pakistan can do and should think about.
That there are concerns about maybe shifting U.S. priorities and how the U.S. is going to respond as the world seems to get more dangerous. In Turkey, we do see some maybe minimal evidence of this concern. A few of the respondents in our survey did write saying that they weren't sure what the U.S. would look like or if the U.S. would be reliable given the challenges of particularly the previous U.S. administration. That being said, I think a lot of these issues really come down to whether or not the U.S. can be a reliable ally. And as we mentioned, that means that the U.S. is stuck between a rock and a hard place. It needs to be able to make sure that it can maintain its commitments and not be overstretched, but also has to make clear what the boundaries of those commitments are.
I want to give a shout out to a project that we're doing with BASIC on nuclear responsibilities. And I think this is the first time. I was fascinated by your research with Lauren and references to it. Nothing of this sort has happened in Pakistan. We don't have public opinion on nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. And I think, frankly, we've crossed that bridge. But with the Nuclear Responsibilities Project, we are engaging and starting a discourse in Pakistan about what Pakistan's nuclear responsibilities entail. And it is Pakistan's nuclear responsibilities as a nuclear weapon state to its citizens and to the countries in the region, and also to the countries beyond the region. So that is where some sort of conversation can begin to take shape. But like I said, we are beyond public opinion influencing any policy. This was the first time, that government had even involved academics into foreign policy processes, making academics part of an advisory group that was set up 2 years back. But nothing of that sort ever happens in Pakistan. It's a closed-door elite conversation in Pakistan. And I think that with our Nuclear Responsibilities Project, we're going to take this conversation forward and engage public as to what nuclear responsibility, both in the civilian nuclear energy domain and also the nuclear weapons domain, should look like in Pakistan. So let's hope for the best.